Right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the sixth installment in the series of Gabungan Darurat Iklim Malaysia seminar series. My name is Evelyn Tay, and I will be the moderator for today's seminar. So Gabungan Darurat Iklim Malaysia, or GDIM in short, is a loose coalition of Malaysian NGOs and CSOs focused on a set vision and mission to address Malaysia's response to global climate and ecological emergency. So sharing with us today the history of Paris Agreement, the lowdown on what this agreement really is all about, and what to expect at the upcoming November COP26 in Glasgow, is our honorable speaker this morning, Ms. Meena Raman, who is the Climate Change Program Coordinator of the World Network, TWN, and the President of Sahabat Alam Malaysia. Please allow me to take a moment to introduce her to our participants in the seminar this morning. Meena Raman was the former chair of Friends of the Earth International, an organization with 77 group members worldwide. As a legal advisor to the Consumers Association of Penang, CAP, she currently heads its community mobilization section, which works with farmers and fisherfolk in Malaysia. Throughout more than 25 years of her career as a public interest lawyer, she has represented organizations and local communities she works with at numerous conferences and legal hearings on environmental and consumer protection issues, from climate change, agriculture and fisheries to globalization and trade. And recently in September, as some of you may have heard, her legal team, who represented the coastal fishermen in Penang, had successfully overturned the EIA approval of the controversial Penang South Reclamation Project in a landmark case at the appeals court of the Department of Environment. Meena has been actively involved in the intergovernmental climate negotiations since COP13 in Bali back in 2007. She has been monitoring and reporting on negotiations and providing analysis and support to developing countries, government, and civil society participants. She also co-authored a book titled A Clash of Climate Change Paradigm, Negotiation and Outcomes at the UN Climate Convention. And the book accounts for what went on at the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change, UNFCCC. You will hear more about these abbreviations and acronyms later, which has become an indispensable for policymakers, researchers, civil society activists, and those interested in climate change issues. For full disclosure, Meena Raman is also my boss at the Third World Network, and needless to say, I'm standing on the shoulder of a giant. Very briefly, TWN is an international research and advocacy organization headquartered in Malaysia, and we are actively engaged at the global level on various issues at international fora, such as the United Nations agencies, conferences and processes such as the CBD and the UNFCCC, the WTO, World Bank, and IMF. So before we begin, I would like to inform the participants that this session will be recorded. Kindly put your name of your organization, if applicable, next to your name so we can identify you. And participants are encouraged to leave their questions in the chat box. And kindly, at all times, ensure that your mic is muted to avoid interrupting the seminar. The seminar will be taking place for 1.5 hours with 3 parts. We will have a 10-minute Q&A session in between all these 3 parts. So without further delay, I shall pass the session to Ms. Meena Raman to take us through Paris Agreement 101. How did it come about and what it is about? Meena, over to you.
Thank you, Evelyn, and very good morning to all of you. Evelyn works with me, but I had no control over the introduction. So thank you for being so generous, Evelyn. It's a real pleasure this morning to be doing this together with the GDI team. Would you like to project the screen? Yeah. It has been a very long road to Paris, and I'm so happy that there's a lot of interest in this. And so forgive me for taking you through this long road, but if we don't have the history of how the Paris Agreement came to be, we will miss out on a lot of the important aspects of the nuances and the political fights in the COP26 and as we go forward as well. So first slide, please. So The chronology actually begins with the Framework Convention, commonly known as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. For those of you who know the history, it actually was born out of the Earth Summit in Rio. Many of us were actually inspired by the Rio Summit, and many of us were actually children of Rio, where there was this big world conference that got together that wanted to look at the problems of the environment, but it became known as the UN Conference on Environment and Development, which also saw a big fight between the North and the South. So that was born in 1990, held in 1992, and one of the offsprings of that is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, when the Climate Change Convention actually was ratified in 1994, after that, parties actually looked at how little were, the developed countries who were supposed to take the lead were actually implementing their targets. So came the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, followed by the Bali Action Plan in 2007, which I will talk about later, the Copenhagen Accord and how it led to a major collapse. And then the Cancun Agreement, which reinvigorated the multilateral negotiating process again, led to the Durban Platform, to the Doha Gateway, to the Warsaw Outcomes, to the Lima Call for Action, which was the prelude to the Paris Agreement. Today, we are not talking about what happened after Paris, but we will look at COP26, and we can go into further details at other sessions if you want. Next session, please. Next slide. So basically, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, actually, it's a pretty good convention. You will not be able to replicate this convention today, given the geopolitics of what's in the world today. But it basically, Article 2 is very important. The objective basically was to stabilize greenhouse gases at levels that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic, which actually means human interference with the climate system, allow ecosystems to adapt, ensure food production is not threatened, and enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. And this principle, Article 3, is so critical, which is actually about equity and recognizing the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities between developed and developing countries, because the Framework Convention recognized that much of the emissions then were actually historic. And even today, if you look at the discussion around the IPCC most recent physical science report of AR6, the sixth assessment report, it also acknowledges that historic emissions were very important, and you need to look at cumulative emissions. So right from history, from the pre-industrial era, and not just focus on today's emissions. So this issue of equity is very important, and which basically means that while the problem is common, the differentiation is because of the fact that those who had historical responsibility have to do much more in terms of the obligations. Next slide, please. So Article 4 of the Framework Convention was about commitments to act. It was actually about to mitigate, which actually means emissions reductions, and to adapt, because you have to respond to the climate crisis, and you cannot just talk about emission reductions, because adaptation is very, very key, and some of you already know this. Then you have the Article 4.3, which is very, very important, that developed countries, known in the Annex 2 of the Kyoto Protocol, actually, and the convention. Annex 2 parties are those who have the financial obligations. They have to provide new and additional finance to developing countries. So Annex 1 is basically the developed countries, and Annex 2 is the countries who have to provide finance, and the developing world is what's called the non-annex parties. Then you have Article 4.7, very, very critical. The extent to which developing countries effectively implement their commitments will depend on the effective implementation by developed countries of their commitments, particularly for the means of implementation, which is finance and technology transfer. Next slide, please. So the Kyoto Protocol, which came into being in 1997, the Annex 1 parties were supposed to reduce their overall emissions by at least 5% below 1990 levels between 2008 and 2012. This is so minimal. And this was because there was a lot of opposition from the developed world to have higher targets. So in Kyoto was also born the emissions trading scheme and the clean development mechanism. What this basically is, which is important for today's discussion as we move to the COP26, the emissions trading scheme and the emissions trading scheme is for Europe. Because what actually happened was the United States was really opposed to any kind of carbon tax. Actually, the Europeans were very keen on carbon tax as a way of carbon pricing. But what the US did was to take them away from carbon taxes and think about emissions trading, which actually gave rise to the trading between in the European Union about giving them allowances and credits and trading in credits. Then you have the clean development mechanism, which actually is the financing which will come from developed world for the developing countries to do the emissions reductions because it's cheaper to do so. And that was how the offset mechanism was born. And this basically means that developing countries will do the emissions reductions for the North. Now, during this time, the developing world did not have their obligations to have targets. This only happened under the Paris Agreement. So under an arrangement where there was no targets for developing countries in terms of emissions reductions, which will really be reviewed and verified and so on, later on, there was some amount of pledges, but really the obligation actually began under the Paris Agreement. So for the Kyoto Protocol parties and the US, after doing everything, left the Kyoto Protocol. And so it created a lot of mess and then left. And this is what they always do. And so this was the first commitment period, 2008 and 2012, very, very little emissions reductions. And then came the Bali Action Plan in 2007, a very key moment because the world wanted the US to come back in terms of taking emission reduction targets. The US was in the convention, but not a party to the Kyoto Protocol. So the mandate under the convention was to reach an agreed outcome on various aspects, such as the shared vision, mitigation, adaptation, technology, and financing. And so there was a 2-year timetable set up under what was called a working group on long-term cooperative action to include all countries, including the US and developing countries, which is now the Paris Agreement. So there was this big negotiations that were supposed to happen. And then the Bali Road Map, very key. There were 2 aspects to the Bali Road Map, and this was because it was agreed to in the 2007 in Bali. So one was this ad hoc working group to actually come up with a process to include all countries in terms of all these aspects. Then there was the second commitment of the Kyoto Protocol, because the Kyoto is a daughter of the convention. And so the second commitment period was supposed to be negotiated. So when you talk about Bali roadmap, it involves both the new agreement under the convention and the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol under the Kyoto Treaty. Then this led to actually the infamous Copenhagen Accord, where it was one of the most untransparent processes, where you had the leaders of the world, including Obama and Angela Merkel, and all of them trying to trap, at that time, the Indian president and also the Chinese, and to put them all into a room. And this was by the Danish presidency. And about 30 heads of states were there in the room, and the rest were all outside. So while the negotiators were negotiating, there was this secret cabal that was trying to come up with something, hatching something, which then led to the Copenhagen Accord. And when the accord was tabled to the rest of the hall, you had many of the ALBA countries who led, particularly Venezuela, Bolivia, and so on, who were strong enough. And then there was a large number of developing countries who supported them, who said that we cannot have any accord recognized because it was untransparent, it was not negotiated, and it was actually a secret deal. So this led to, there was a lack of consensus, and then it led to a massive collapse of the talks. So the accord was only noted. Next slide, please. So then we came to the Cancun Agreement the next year, and this was hosted by the present Espinosa, Patricia Espinosa, who was the current UNFCCC's executive secretary. She was then the Minister of Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mexico. And she was responsible for getting the world together to make sure that you don't have another collapse, because otherwise what would have happened is that there would be no confidence that there could be a global agreement. So she managed to do this, the Cancun Agreement of 2010. And the limit to temperature rise to 2 degrees C was something that was first agreed to. Economy-wide targets for the Annex 1 countries. Nationally appropriate mitigation actions for developing countries. This was on a voluntary, for what they call the NAMAs. This was for voluntarily for developing countries to indicate what they will do. And then there was this fast start finance and discussion on long-term finance. So the Green Climate Fund also, which we will talk about later, was born out of the Cancun Agreement, which was really important. But what the Cancun Agreement did during the Cancun discussion, Bolivia had at that time tried to bring in this concept of fair shares. Actually, they didn't call it fair shares. It was called the equitable access to atmospheric space. They wanted an arrangement where there would be looking at the existing carbon budget and taking into account historical emissions and looking at the current emissions and looking at what the carbon budget is and looking at the per capita emissions. How can you have a equitable distribution of the atmospheric space? And that would have meant that you have a top-down way of determining what countries must do. Of course, this was rejected by the developed world, particularly by the United States, who said that nobody can dictate to us what we should do, by how much we should do, and when we should do. So already in the Copenhagen Accord, which was rejected or not adopted, came this Cancun Agreement, which actually institutionalized what's called the precursor to the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, which is a bottom-up approach, which basically means countries can pledge what they would do by how much they would do. And so there was no way of measuring whether you were actually doing what you call your fair shares or whether it is equitable. So that was already locked in. Then you came to the Durban platform in 2011, which actually agreed that there would be a development of a protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force under the convention, applicable to all parties, and under the Kyoto Protocol to agree to a second commitment period cut and time frame. Now, this was very contentious because what the developed world actually wanted to do was actually to kill the convention. And this we have to pay attention to, because till today, they keep doing that. And why they wanted to kill the convention was basically to wipe out historical responsibility, so that that principle of common but differentiated becomes common and shared responsibility. So they wanted to wipe out equity, which is really, really unjust. So that was their agenda. And the other agenda they had was actually to have it as a mitigation agreement, a mitigation only agreement. And so this discussion in Durban was basically to leave the options open for parties then to come up with an agreement that would be fair. So that led to the Doha Gateway in 2012, because there was a resistance and reluctance to talk about the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol by the Annex 1 parties of the Kyoto. And what you actually had then finally in 2012 was the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol from 2013 to 2020. The emission cuts were agreed to be at least 18% below 1990 levels, and to revisit commitments by the end of 2014 to raise the ambition level of the Annex 1 parties. Now, this was key for developing countries. They said, if you want us to talk about a new agreement, you must do this at the very least. And that's how there was agreement to go forward. Next, until now, just to say, there is no revisit. They never revisited, and the second commitment period, the Kyoto Protocol, only came into effect on December 2020, on the last month when it ought to have been operational from 2013. So you can see the recalcitrance of the developed world. They promise one thing and don't deliver. And what happens all the time is to ask the developing countries to give more and more concessions in return for nothing really very much, but a lot of promises. Next, please. So the Lima call for action was also very dramatic. This was very important at that time. One of the good things to remember that Malaysia was the spokesperson of the like-minded developing countries. We're very proud that at that time, Professor Datuk Budial Singh Nija led this very important coalition called the like-minded developing countries. You have big countries like India, like China. We also have, for some time, we had the Philippines, but Philippines left after a lot of pressure from Washington. You will see that there's a lot of push and pressure by the developed world to actually weaken the like-minded. So at that time, Malaysia led the like-minded as a spokesperson. So you have countries also like Saudi Arabia, very, very key player in the climate negotiations. You also have a lot of the Middle Eastern countries, including Iran, and you have the ALBA, the Nicaragua, the Cuba, the Venezuela, and at that time they also had Ecuador and Bolivia, and you had some of the African countries, including Egypt, a very key player, and you also have Sudan and others, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and you have Sri Lanka and Vietnam, a very key player from the ASEAN region. So a very key group of countries from various parts of the globe, but also representing large and small countries. And the reason why the like-minded came together was because the G77 was actually weakened tremendously. There were many groupings, because how they negotiate is they negotiate in terms of groupings. Before, there used to be a very solid group of 77 in China, which basically means not just 77 countries, but all the developing countries, 194 plus, or 92 or something plus, come together negotiating as a bloc. But they were tremendously weakened. You have the Alliance of Small Island States. You have the countries which were very pro-US, called the ILAC, which is the Latin American opposite of the ALBA. And then you have the African group, which is more or less quite close to the like-minded in terms of its principles and ways forward and positions. And then you have the Arab group. And then in the developed world, you also have the umbrella group, which is the non-European countries. And then you have the European Union, which negotiates. And now the UK, which is left, they are on their own at the moment, but they are aligned with the EU most likely. So that gives you the big power play in terms of the process. And so you had the Geneva session. EU seems to be far away from the Copenhagen text. I was wondering, maybe I will take the question after this. Then you have because they were working towards the Paris Agreement, the language on differentiation in Lima, there was a lot of discussion because there was an attempt, as I said, to blur differentiation. Differentiation means the common but differentiated, developed and developing countries. Lot of effort to blur the differentiation so that they want to have a shared responsibility. Then there was a big discussion about the intended nationally determined contributions. It was a huge push to ask parties to communicate their intended nationally determined contributions even before the Paris Agreement was agreed to. So this was actually pushed by the EU primarily, and then was also supported by the other developed worlds. And they actually were more focused on mitigation alone. They were not interested in a comprehensive agreement. As I said, they always wanted to have mitigation centric. So many of the developing countries were asking, how can you ask us to formulate and communicate an intended NDC when we have not even looked at the architecture of the Paris Agreement, and we don't know what the climate finance is going to be. So there was a lot of fight, but the negotiation in Lima was to make sure that none of that was fixed in terms of mitigation centric only. So the scope of the Paris Agreement was really, really very key in terms of Lima, what that architecture will be. And then there was the inclusion of loss and damage in the decision. Now, just to say what is loss and damage, because people look at, I think most of you would already know by now, but let me just explain for those who are quite newcomers on this. Adaptation, there are limits to adaptation, right? Adaptation is the response to climate. So if you are going to be facing sea level rise, what do you do? How do you build your barriers and so on? And you strengthen your coastlines and strengthen your resilience to climate. But in a lot of situations, and now more and more, and we will see this much more in the coming years with the climate emergency, that adaptation is no longer sufficient. More and more hurricanes, tropical cyclones, massive economies with one rainfall wiped out. And so, and then also that someone is extreme weather and also slow onset events, where you have in very slow processes, salinization of the soils and all kinds of things happening that, that will alter the way we know life as it is. So the developing world pushed very hard for loss and damage to be a separate pillar. This issue of loss and damage was already in the Warsaw 1 year before the Warsaw COP, but it was still linked to adaptation, because the United States again was very opposed to a separate pillar, because they didn't want more financial obligations. They said, if it's mitigation, if it's adaptation, if there's loss and damage, more money will be needed. So we cannot agree to a separate pillar. So that was essentially the beginnings of the fight that went forward in Paris. So there was the Geneva negotiation text in 2015. I'll take you through that before we go to Paris. Next, please. Next slide. So the negotiation text of Geneva had 90 pages, 12 sections, 224 paragraphs, and lots of options. So as I said, main thing was differentiation. And if you look at differentiation, some of the options were to have Annex 1, non-Annex 1, Annex 2, Annex X, parties not in Annex, I mean, it was just crazy. All these various options, parties not in Annex X, Annex Y, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in light of different national circumstances. Now that last, in light of different national circumstances, was what happened in Lima after the US-China agreement. The Chinese were fighting very hard not to give in. And what they did was they have this comma after comma, CBDRC, in light of different national circumstances. So that was the compromise. But till today, you will have a big fight of exactly what that means. Yeah. So particularly vulnerable countries in a position to do so, major economies, evolving common but differentiated responsibilities. So all these options which were there, including major emitters and so on. Next slide, please. So on mitigation, the issues were, how do we get to the long-term objective, whether differentiated mitigation or whether NDCs or no, yeah, because the developing countries fought hard to keep stronger the differentiation in terms of the type of obligations under mitigation. And then the developed countries not enhancing their level of ambition. That was a very serious concern. And no long-term trajectory on mitigation by developing countries without indication on the means of implementation in the long term. Developing countries were always very conscious that we have to link what we need to do in terms of mitigation to the finance and technology transfer and the capacity building. For without the means of implementation, it was really difficult for them to move on the low carbon pathway. And then the big discussion was markets or no markets in the agreement. Next slide. Adaptation and loss and damage, what were the issues? Goal, whether there should be a unified vision on adaptation, because there was this long-term goal on temperature. It was always about 2 degrees or 1.5, and adaptation had no goal. So that was very important for the developing countries to say we are always making adaptation an orphan to mitigation. So we should have a goal on adaptation. And so that was one of the issues. The means of implementation, very key, linked to adaptation. And then this important aspect of the measurement, reporting, and verification of support. Now, this MRV system, this is basically what's called the transparency framework. This was actually pushed by the United States already in Cancun. What this basically means is that countries should communicate their reports, and they should also be measured, reported, and verified in terms of their mitigation actions. But developing countries were also pushing for MRV of support, because they said, we also want to measure, we also want the reporting, and we also want the verification of the means of implementation, because you can't have one side and not the other. So this was the transparency framework in terms of reviews. So what this will mean is that parties, when they do their communications and their update reports and so on, there will be a review, a technical review panel, and they will look at what it is, and they will have a process to ask the parties, what are you doing? How much are you doing? Why do you say this? Why do you do that? So it was much more about transparency, and also to have some kind of an accountability mechanism. So that was what the MRV was about, because the US was particularly concerned about China and whether you can actually question what China is doing or not doing. And there was this thing for the developing countries called international consultation and analysis. That's the process that was agreed to. There will be an international consultation and analysis. And some of the developing countries would joke and say, this was like the CIA, not ICA, but the CIA. And that was so funny. Yeah, but it was serious. And so the other issues was whether there was a separate pillar for loss and damage, having references which only address the concerns of, that was the other thing, whether you should only look at LDC SIDS in countries in Africa in terms of vulnerabilities, because that's what they were trying to do. Redefining the notion of what's vulnerable countries. Particularly vulnerable. Is particularly vulnerable only LDCs and SIDS and Africa? So there was a big fight back, because the convention does not recognize vulnerability in accordance to LDC, SIDS, or Africa. It talks about circumstances of vulnerability, whether mountains, coastal, so all countries are included. So this is to ensure that, and we all know all countries are vulnerable, including in this country. Now then, institutional arrangements, there was a discussion about the Green Climate Fund and how do you link it, and then institutions of the convention, including the technology mechanism and other mechanisms, and issues about the registry, adaptation registry. Next, please. Next line. So finance, these were the issues. So all parties to mobilize finance, or developed parties to provide finance. So can you imagine, the developed world had the audacity to begin to look at climate finance as if all countries had the obligations to provide the climate finance. So what they were saying basically was that, oh, you have China, which is a large amount of money, so they should also be providing finance. And so this actually reinterprets what the convention is all about, because the finance under the convention was about a climate debt. It was the recognition of historical responsibility. And that is how the financial obligations came to be. So it's not about asking developing countries to provide the finance as a legal obligation, and that is a problem. So then the issue about whether the finance is new, or whether they would normally call finance, but if development finance, as you know, 0.7% of overseas development assistance, which is what the UN obligation is. But what many developed countries do, reclassify that ODA and call it climate finance. So if, for example, if you have money, we've given money to teach women in schools, that is climate finance. I mean, that's nonsensical, yeah? So developing countries were pushing new, additional, adequate, unpredictable, and grant-based, particularly grant-based for adaptation, or no, or this is a no-go, because this is what the other side did not want. And then on the anchoring of the institutions, climate resilience and sustainable development mechanism, this is now the Article 6 discussion. what kind of development mechanism under the cooperative approaches. Standing Committee on Finance, very key. This actually was born out of Cancun. This was a committee to assist the convention in terms of looking at the finance aspects in totality, and then the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund. And now, then the issue was whether, about quantified or not, developed countries were to provide at least 1% of the GDP per year from 2020. This is what the G77 was asking, and additional funds during the pre-2020 period to the GCF. So what they were trying to do was to actually set a target in terms of a percentage of the GDP. Of course, the developed world will say no, and they give excuses like, oh, our parliaments cannot approve this upfront. We don't know what our economy would look like. We can't give you an upfront information about what's available. And then so all this, so whether there should be a quantified, short-term quantified goal, and then whether the NDCs must include financial contributions. So all of these were issues. Next, please. Technology development and transfer. I'll speed it up a little bit, not to go so much in detail. It's supposed to be 101, but I think I'm doing 102. So the global goal on technology, this was what the developing countries wanted. But at that time, they were talking of 2 degrees because we hadn't gone into the Paris era yet. And so the issue was really what kind of technology transfer, if you have but to meet a particular temperature goal, what are the kinds of technologies needed, how much they will cost, and so much, and so on and so forth. And how do you enhance environmentally sound technologies and access? Now, the problem here was technology became one of the most important levers that the developed countries have in terms of their competitive advantage. So it was an economic, actually the climate agreement is not an environmental agreement. You are negotiating the economy of a country, the kind of transformation that needs to happen in all sectors. And so technology being a very key aspect of that. And for the developed countries, one of the things they were completely opposed to was intellectual property rights. They said that whenever developing countries wanted to talk about what technologies had intellectual property rights on them, how much of patents are there in the renewable technologies, whether it's solar, whether it's the wind turbines, what aspects of that in the renewable area, and then the forthcoming new technology. So they're very keen on, developing countries were very keen on understanding how you can actually waive the what's called the intellectual property rights, which is actually under the WTO. Right now, all of you must have heard about the waiver for the TRIPS agreement, trade-related intellectual property rights agreement under the WTO, which makes it very difficult for developing countries to even access medicines because of high IPRs. And so this also applies to all kinds of technologies, including climate technologies. So even in the vaccine fight and the inequity on the vaccine fight, the same thing we see happen in the climate fight. So developing countries were saying, we want to know, and there were actual proposals on the table on how, because climate is a global problem, that how there is this emergency, and therefore the developed world should not have strong IPR regime. And the developed world could not allow even the term IPR. So we say that in the UNFCCC, IPRs are a dirty word because the United States and Japan and the EU, they would not have this discussed. So the only way forward for developing countries was to talk about the barriers. So behind, what are the barriers? Because the developed countries will always say, oh, there are no barriers. So what is your problem? But developing countries would come back and say, no, there are barriers. So this is crazy. Yeah? This is the kind of, which is still today, whether there is real technology transfer is something that is hugely debatable, because it's about what the developed world wants is for the developing countries to buy their technologies, not to actually have real technology transfer so that developing countries can do their own. But for us as civil society, it's also important to look at the technology assessments, because we don't want geoengineering technologies to simply be transferred, yeah, or other bad technologies. Okay, next slide. Then this whole transparency of action and support, which is, I think I'll skip it's too detailed. It's basically about whether to have a common transparency framework, which I will come to when I talk about the Paris Agreement. Yeah. So the next one was about the kind of agreement. What kind of agreement? Is it a protocol? Is it another legal instrument? Is it an agreed outcome with legal force? So huge discussion. So the US was thinking of a legal instrument with some legally binding elements, because could this be done by a presidential executive agreement? Because if you notice, at that time when Obama was there, the Congress was very hostile to climate. So the US could not have any new agreement, but they could have an executive order, a presidential executive order. And that's why sometimes you hear the US say Paris Accord, because that's how they call it. Basically, it's a Paris Agreement. And so, so it's important to understand this history and these nuances. Next slide. Okay, next is the Paris Agreement. So I'll stop here for a while, and then we'll entertain some questions. Evelyn?
Thank you, Mina. Thank you for walking us through the history of Paris Agreement and basically trying to compress about 14 years altogether in just a matter of half an hour. Firstly, I see a hand up, but may I just take the questions in the chat box first? So there's one question on the EU and carbon tax. So the question goes like this from Nazri Othman from Kami. Ms. Mina, earlier you mentioned that EU seems to be a fan of the carbon tax. I was wondering, in your opinion, whether in a local context, is carbon tax feasible to be implemented in Malaysia?
Okay, certainly carbon tax is feasible, but I think the issue is really whether it's politically feasible. At this point in time, if you look at the 12th Malaysia Plan, they do talk about a carbon tax, but they talk about a feasibility study to look at carbon pricing, both a carbon tax and an emissions trading scheme. So the country is talking about an emissions trading scheme of which they have no experience. They're quite good at taxes. As you know, the IRB, the Internal Revenue Authority is the most feared authority in this country. But so we have experience, but it will not happen this year or the next year because they are very worried about the political implications. But certainly it's something that we should advocate for.
Thank you, Mina. And the following question is from Damien Tanam. How has Malaysia fared so far in all these agreements? So all the way from Rio to Paris, whether Putrajaya is a signatory or not?
Malaysia ratified the Paris Agreement. I mean, in 2016 already. It came into effect in 2016. So Malaysia has agreed to all the obligations. So it's not an issue. But how active are they in the international arena? We can talk about that. Because they were active, very active up to Paris. After Paris, you don't see Malaysia speaking up very prominently. I mean, they were used to be the spokesperson of the like-minded. They are no longer the spokesperson. Why, when, and how? I mean, we can talk offline. But basically, just to say that how they are fared in terms of their targets and all, they tell us that that emissions, recently they updated, right, 45% emissions intensity of GDP from 2021 to 2030. And they said that they are on track to meet it. And they've also put in from a conditional, they changed it to an unconditional pledge, which means they feel that they can do it all on their own accord. And then they talk about carbon neutrality 2050. We can talk, we probably can have another session on all that and what Malaysia's roadmap is, because that I think is really critical on the way forward. But I think you need to know the multilateral obligations first, and in order to understand whether Malaysia is actually looking at this in a holistic way or not.
Thank you, Mina. I have a hand raised, but actually the mode of today's seminar is that you leave your questions in the chat box. But I'll probably give an exception to Kevin if you want to speak up, because we do have a limited time. But please keep your question very short if possible. But if not, I will really appreciate if you put it in the chat box. Thank you so much. So Mina, if you want to take a sip of water before you continue in the second part, please do so, because the next section is on Paris Agreement. And let me just share it. the screen. Yes, Mina, you may proceed anytime you're ready.
Okay, this huge picture. You mean, you know, everybody's so happy with the Paris Agreement, and you know, it was a big thing. All of us were there. Okay, next one. Next slide. So what's in it? Next slide. Okay, so very important. I give you the history and all the fights. Now you see where it has landed. Yeah. So one of the key things was that the Paris Agreement is to enhance the convention implementation. This is very, very important. It was actually a huge fight by the like-minded developing countries. And why this is significant is because, as I said, the developed world wanted to crash the convention. But the developing countries have always gathered and said, the Paris Agreement is not to replace the convention, but it is to enhance the convention's implementation. So that's really very, very key. So the second thing is holding temperature rise to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and pursue efforts to limit to 1.5 degrees centigrade. This was a major achievement for those who were fighting for the recognition of the 1.5 degrees. So at the best case is to have pursue efforts to limit 1.5 degrees centigrade. And the reason why this is an issue is really because if you have a 1.5 degrees temperature goal, the amount of carbon budget left is only about 500 gigatons of carbon. And at the rate we are emitting about, not we, the world is emitting about 42 gigatons a year, this will be exhausted with 10 to 12 years all gone, which means that there is no budget left. And then if the 2 degrees, the carbon budget is a bit bigger, it's 2000 plus gigatons. So countries are very worried, particularly those who are emitting very big, including China and India. Although per capita terms, they are lower than the developed world, they are very concerned about the climate, the range, because the whole thrust is being on them. Because the developed world does very little. They don't do their fair shares. So how do you push everything on India and China to actually take on the massive transformation that has to happen? So this, because there is no notion of what is fair shares. So that's why there is this big gap. And of course, for civil society and social movements, we all say that 1.5 degrees centigrade is the guardrail, and we are already at 1.1. So the challenge is hugely phenomenal. So then the increase in ability to adapt to adverse impacts, foster climate resilience and low GHG emissions development in a manner not to threaten food production. This is in the purpose of Article 2. And also to make climate finance flows consistent with low emissions pathway and climate resilient development, and implement the agreement to reflect equity and CBDRRC in light of different national circumstances. So that's the purpose of the Paris Agreement. And we must always remember, it's not just the temperature goal. It's also about adaptation. It's also about finance, and also about equity. Next, please. So then we come to this notorious Article 3. Why I say notorious? Because it was fought so hard. Fought again by the like-minded developing countries, because we saw that fight happen. Because the NDCs, the developed world wanted mitigation centric. And even you had some small island states who did not understand why the like-minded was actually pushing for comprehensive NDCs, because the like-minded came up with the idea that NDC should comprise mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology transfer. All this is important, particularly for the developing world. And it's not just mitigation, but it's also adaptation, which is important, because that's the climate response that a developing country is doing. Whether the developed world wants to put an adaptation contribution in their NDC, it's up to them. But for developing countries, this was important. So this was what the argument was. Finally, luckily, after the huge fight, because this was a fantastic red line for the like-minded, they said, if you do not have a comprehensive NDC, we cannot agree to this agreement. And so one of this was a major effort. So NDCs are now called, NDCs, Article 3 describes it as a global response to climate change All parties are to undertake and communicate ambitious efforts covering mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology transfer, capacity building, and somehow they have this transparency framework as a way of looking at how we achieve that as well, and in achieving the Paris Agreement. So that's what it is. And then efforts to reflect progression over time, recognizing the need to support developing countries for effective implementation. So that's important. But what you have to remember is that once you communicate your first NDC, and you have to keep progressing, and that's important. You cannot regress. You cannot go stand balik. Yeah. Although there was an effort by some for developing countries to say, what if you're like the pandemic, for instance, and the pandemic caused a lot of issues, and so a country can no longer, it doesn't have a national budget, everything is exhausted, or whatever. Can it re-look at its NDC? And that issue was not settled. Under the Paris Agreement, you only go forward, you cannot go backwards. So the first NDC to be communicated no later than the party ratifies the Paris Agreement. And so, as I said earlier, in Lima, some parties were already putting their intended nationally determined contribution. So the Paris Agreement recognized that if a party has communicated an intended NDC prior to joining the agreement, that party shall be considered as having satisfied this provision, meaning you don't have to resubmit, yeah, because you already have indicated when you ratify, before your ratification. So that's exactly what the obligations are. And then this part, if an intended INDC contains a time frame up to 2025, the party is supposed to communicate by 2020 a new NDC, and to do so every 5 years. Now, this is hotly misunderstood. But basically what it means, and only 2 countries in the world at that time had a 5-year time frame, and that was the United States and the Marshall Islands. But the US now doesn't have a 5-year time frame. I think it's longer. Of course, I stand corrected. I forget. Huh? Evelyn, you can correct me later. I think it is 10 years. And then what happened is basically that if the INDCs contain a time frame up to 2030, now you don't no longer call it INDC because it became an NDC. So you communicate by 2020 these contributions, and to do so every 5 years. So you can resubmit your same communication, or you can, so it's called communicate or update. And Malaysia chose to update. That's why they have put in an updated NDC. And the only difference is from 10% conditional, it has become 0% conditional. So that's called an update, yeah. And they had more gases covered and this and that. So that's fine to do. Next, please. So Article 4, it deals with NDCs and mitigation. And why I put there NDCs and mitigation, because some people call Article 4 as a mitigation article. And I say no, it deals with mitigation and NDCs. And for NDCs, you have to go back to the Article 3 definition, which is comprehensive. So this is what it says. Parties aim to reach global peaking. Very key for you to pay attention to this. This is where the net zero comes from. Parties aim to reach global peaking of emissions as soon as possible, and will take longer for developing countries, and to undertake rapid reductions so as to balance between ambitions and sinks in the second half of the century in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. Very key. Yeah? So it doesn't say all parties to go forward. With the developed world is looking at net zero as balance between emissions and sinks, what 1 ton emitted, 1 ton sequestered, net zero, and all have to go there by second half of the century. This is not what the Paris Agreement says. Paris Agreement, this is global. You cannot have net zero for everybody because the carbon budget doesn't allow the developed countries to do net zero in 2050. And that is really the biggest fraud of all time. I can talk more later about that one. And then each party, what is the obligation? Each party shall prepare, communicate, and maintain successive NDCs that it intends to achieve. Now, this is important. For those of you who are lawyers like me, every word is important. that it intends to achieve. Why was this put in? Intends. Because the United States says we cannot have an obligation which says that you have to achieve it. So the US considerably weakened the Paris Agreement, and every agreement or decision is taken by consensus. All you need is one party to block it. But when Bolivia blocked the Cancun Agreement from being adopted because there was no equitable sharing of atmospheric space proposal, Bolivia was overruled. But when the United States objected, the United States is allowed through. So that's power politics for you, yeah? And so this is an intention to achieve. So it's not about achieving. Then pursue domestic mitigation measures with the aim of achieving the objectives of such contributions. So basically, that's what it is. Next. So the differentiation in mitigation, this is how it is. Developed countries should take the lead. So the developed countries are supposed to undertake economy-wide absolute emission reduction targets. People sometimes don't understand what is absolute emission reduction. Sometimes we hear people say Malaysia is 40% reductions of emissions. It's not true. Our emissions reductions is not absolute. It's pitched to the GDP. So it's emissions intensity target. Yeah, it's economy-wide, but it's emissions intensity target. So there is a difference between absolute and there is a difference in emissions intensity targets. So the other thing is that the support shall be provided to developing countries by developed countries, and enhanced support for enhanced action. Very key part in the Article 4. NDCs are to be recorded in a public registry maintained by the Secretariat. And then developing countries, we continue to enhance mitigation efforts, encouraged to move over time towards economy-wide emission reduction or limitation targets. This was because some countries actually have renewable energy targets, or what they call SPAMs, or what they call sustainable action plans, you know. So which is by sector targets and not economy-wide. So what they want, the Paris Agreement says that you have to move over time. They don't say what time, but I'm sure there will be a ratchet pressure. Then LDCs and SIDS may prepare and communicate strategies, plans, and actions for low emissions development. This was to recognize the special circumstances of the LDCs and SIDS. But before I depart, one thing you need to know, I mean, from this slide, one thing you need to know is Singapore. Singapore joins the Alliance of Small Island States, and it calls itself a SID. Now, it is true it's an island, but it's certainly one of the most richest countries in the world. But they're very clever, so they come under the SIDS. So you need to know. So when we talk about, oh, why aren't we negotiating as ASEAN? Because Singapore doesn't have the similar type of obligations as the rest. Yeah, Cambodia and Laos, of course, they are LDCs, but you need to know the differences in the nuances. Next, please. Article 5 is on forest. I think this is very important for people who are following the forest discussions. I think it's we don't pay enough attention to Article 5 because there is this discussion. Everybody knows about REDD+, results-based payments. Basically, what this means is that developing countries conserve, protect sustainable use of their forests, including enhancing forest plantation stocks, including enhancing stocks. So what they are planting is monoculture plantations are also allowed, but this is something that it's a big fight. Yeah, but REDD+ is when you do it, you don't get upfront money. It's results-based payments. That means you do whatever you have to do, and then you will be paid for it when you show that you have your emission reference levels and you have sequestered, and therefore we'll pay you according to what you have done. But the other element is the joint mitigation and adaptation approaches. This is nothing to do with results-based payments. It's joint mitigation and adaptation approaches, which we don't talk about enough in this country. We are REDD+ fixated. We don't look at this joint mitigation and adaptation approaches. This is upfront payment, meaning it's not based on results. It's based on proposals or actions that developing countries will take in terms of looking at forests for both mitigation and adaptation, and not just looking at it as a carbon payment. Yeah. So this is an approach that's critical for those of us in countries, forest-rich countries like us. So they should take action to conserve and enhance. So that's important. Next. Article 6, this is the famous Article 6, which is going to be fought. It was one of those outstanding items where in Poland, there was supposed to be the Paris rules of implementation and implementation of what are the rules for implementation of the Paris Agreement. There was no agreement on what those rules were for Article 6. And that is still outstanding. It is supposed to be COP26 taking forward on that. And why? Because it's been hugely, hugely controversial. Article 6 nowhere mentions markets. Nowhere. You read Article 6, doesn't mention markets because it's hidden. Yeah. So, and some countries want to talk about it and say, particularly Bolivia and others who say that Article 6 is not about markets. And they are right, because what they want to emphasize is that the convention is a non-market convention. Yeah. So, of course, the other side's view is that carbon markets have been launched. So that's why you have this huge divide. So it's really about cooperative approaches. And what it basically means is that parties can choose to pursue voluntary cooperation between two parties. Yeah. And what that cooperation is, the use of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes towards NDCs. That means parties can transfer mitigation outcomes among themselves to achieve their NDC. So this is seen as carbon trading. Yeah, this is how it is interpreted. And then you have a mitigation mechanism and support sustainable development. This is called Article 4. This is about the CDM plus, the Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. And that is extended to be a mitigation mechanism to support sustainable development. This is Brazil and others who have actually advanced this. And then in the Article 6.4, it is quite clear, it says in the article, that the mechanism cannot be double counted. That means offsets cannot be counted. Yeah, you cannot have a country giving money and then taking the carbon credits and accounting for the credits and accounting for offsets. Or it cannot be claiming either. You cannot have a country that claims the credits and the host country also claiming the credits, so you can't. So this is something that's not supposed to happen. And also there's supposed to be environmental integrity maintained. Now all this, how do you do it and this and that, is the big problem. But one thing I'd like to say is that there were proposals for safeguards in terms of the carbon markets. One of this was actually to limit the amount that can be offset. Yeah. But as climate justice activists, there is no room for offsets, actually, frankly, and we'll come to that more, even at the national level. You can't be offsetting your way out of this. Then you have the non-market-based approaches. Very interesting, fantastic, very good proposals coming from Bolivia and the like-minded on how you can do non-market-based approaches, which is really voluntary cooperation, linking actions by developing countries to finance technology transfer for both mitigation and adaptation. So this article is about mitigation and adaptation. People forget that. They always see it as a mitigation. It's not. It's adaptation and mitigation. Next, please. Then Article 7 on adaptation. There's a global goal on adaptation of enhancing adaptive capacity. What exactly is the global goal is not clear yet. And that's one of the things that's being articulated in COP26 and as we move on. Because that has been challenged. Because temperature goal, 1.5, 2 degrees, easy to see. But what exactly is an adaptation goal? What Article 7 recognizes is enhancing the adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, reducing vulnerability, contributing to sustainable development, and ensuring adequate response to the temperature goal. And then that adaptation efforts of developing countries shall be recognized. You recognize support for adaptation, and each party submit and update periodically an adaptation communication without creating an additional burden on developing countries. And an adaptation communication can be a component of an NDC. This is actually why you see all this is because there were countries who were very confused, deliberately were made to confuse. How do you express an adaptation in your NDC? Do you express it as part of your adaptation, an adaptation component of your NDC? Or is it a separate adaptation communication? And so this provides all that options. And even in Malaysia, if you look at our NDC, it's very strange because they decided to follow, they put the mitigation part there, and then adaptation is like at the back. Yeah. And the reason for this is that they're not, basically, I don't think that the country has sufficiently appreciated the fact that it's so important to also have this as your contribution, so that the less money that you have no choice but to adapt. You cannot say, oh, when floods happen or whatever, that we don't have to adapt or we don't have to respond. That national budget has to be spent. So it's very critical for developing countries to communicate an adaptation contribution. So I hope that in future, our adaptation contribution is much more rigorous and robust in terms of our communication. And it's going to be more and more important. Next, please. So then loss and damage, very good. We got loss and damage in Article 8, very happy, everybody happy, but there's a catch and I'll come to that. And you recognize loss and damage, Warsaw mechanism subject to the Conference of Parties under the Paris Agreement. No need to go into all the details because there is a Warsaw mechanism on loss and damage, which is actually supposed to help developing countries address loss and damage. Because loss and damage is not just about money. It's also about your technical, your capacities, how did you rescue, how do you do a lot of things, yeah? And so in Madrid, there was actually a Santiago framework set up of an expert group to actually help developing countries in terms of articulating further what are the kinds of actions that are needed to help loss and damage become really implementable. Because everything you start with something, but then the implementation really needs more clarity and actual implementation to help developing countries to make it work. And of course, the developed world, both for adaptation and mitigation, they always talk about risk insurance. Now, which insurance companies are going to give you risk insurance for all that? Yeah, it's very difficult. Then they always talk about the markets having to do this. The private sector will do this, but actually, it's very difficult. And then how do you look at early warning systems, emergency preparedness, slow onset events which are irreversible and permanent, non-economic losses, resilience of communities, livelihoods, and it goes very important for us. This is going to be more and more important. So at GDI, we have to pay a lot more attention to loss and damage and adaptation as a priority. And then the catch is in Paris, the US allowed this to go with this article on the understanding, and they had a small huddle with some small island developing states, and they came up with this decision which said that Article 8 does not involve or provide the basis for any liability or compensation. Because the US is very worried for anybody who will file actions or claim that because of its emissions that the country can claim a lot of money, and the US wanted this. But this doesn't mean there is no money for loss and damage, because this is about claiming liability for loss and damage. But if a developing country puts, this is my contention, and this is what I have been arguing, that if we want to go to the Green Climate Fund, there is nothing to stop us to put in a proposal that addresses early warning systems, emergency preparedness, cope with slow onset events, understand what to do in terms of understanding non-economic losses. There's nothing for us to stop us from going to the Green Climate Fund and say that I have this proposal and I want to do this, and I need the money for it. Yeah. So that's different from a liability or compensation issue, but it's about financing for loss and damage. Next, please. And then Article 9 on finance, very, very important. A number of very good achievements here. Developed countries shall provide financial resources to developing countries for both mitigation and adaptation. And then other parties encouraged to provide voluntarily. This, you remember in the beginning, I was saying that there was this effort to get developing countries to also provide the finance. The final landing zone was this: other parties encouraged to provide voluntarily. And then developed countries to take the lead in mobilizing climate finance, because there is two parts to it. One is a provision of finance, and the other is a mobilizing of finance. And there are big differences here, because shall provide means you have to provide. Mobilizing means you can mobilize it from a vast range of variety of sources and instruments and channels, and could be the multilateral development banks, it could be whatever, yeah. So that mobilization, and it could be what you call from the private sector. So then it should represent a progression beyond previous efforts, very important. So it's not just progress on mitigation, progress on finance as well. Scaled up resources should aim for balance between mitigation and adaptation, and take into account those that are particularly vulnerable to adverse effects and have capacity constraints such as LDCs and SIDS. Consider the need for public and grant-based resources for adaptation. Developed countries shall biennially communicate indicative, quantitative, qualitative information. This is so key. I won't read the whole thing, but this is called Article 9.5, major importance, because developing countries said, we want to know what kind of financial resources you have upfront, so that we are able to inform the preparation of our NDCs. Because you can't expect us to just do our NDCs without knowing what the match will be. And that matching is very important. And so this is key. There was recently the developed countries were supposed to communicate, and developing countries looked at that what they were communicating, and still it is not up to the mark yet. They are still not communicating enough. Then you have the financial mechanisms, the convention, which is the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, and the Global Environment Facility, which will serve the Paris Agreement. And then the mobilization goal, that 100 billion per year by 2020, which they couldn't meet, they extended it to 2025. But prior to 2025, the conference, the CMA refers to the Conference of Parties of the Paris Agreement. That's all it is, yeah? Because the parties of the Paris Agreement, like the COP is the Conference of Parties of the Framework Convention. The CMA is the parties to the Paris Agreement. And they are supposed to set a new collective goal from a floor of 100 billion per year. And it's supposed to be based on the needs of developing countries, different from picking it from the hat, which I'll come to again later. So, so you have the GCF, the GEF, you have the LDC fund, and you have the special climate, this is another special climate change fund administered by the GEF, and all that are still there. And if you want to know more details, we can talk about it at another session. And then this is controversial. The adaptation fund may serve the Paris Agreement, subject to relevant decisions by the Conference of Parties to the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement Conference. The reason why that is because the adaptation fund was born out of Kyoto Protocol. And that was why this becomes controversial, because the Kyoto Protocol is the adaptation fund is funded by a share of levies coming from the CDM. So this is the problem. But now there is an agreement that the adaptation fund will serve the Paris Agreement, but there's a big discussion of how that will happen. Next, please. Technology transfer. This is one of the weakest outcomes in the Paris Agreement. If you look at it, it basically says long-term vision shared on importance of realizing technology development and transfer. Hurrah, like they didn't know. Parties shall strengthen cooperative action on technology development and strengthen cooperation, not actually transfer. Yeah. Technology mechanism serves as the PMO institution, blah, blah, talk. Technology framework established in the pursuit of long-term vision. So another framework, another institution, another process. Collaboration between the technology mechanism and the financial mechanism. Okay, fine. Finance and technology link, fine. Support, including finance provided for cooperative action on technology development transfer, and global stocktake on efforts related to support will come there. So basically, nothing really much on technology transfer. Next, please. Enhance capacity and ability of developing countries, in particular SIDS, LDCs, to take effective climate action. Should be country-driven, responsive to national needs, effective, iterative, participatory, gender responsive, all nice words. How do you do it? All parties should cooperate and developed countries should enhance support. So for me, this is one of the weakest outcomes. And then you have the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, which is supposed to help in capacity needs. Next, please. Transparency framework. I won't go too detailed into it. Only to say, if you remember that transparency framework that was there in Cancun, now what has happened is that there is a common transparency framework. It's called Enhanced Transparency Framework, both for action and for support. This is your reporting, your measuring, and your verification. The only thing is that there's supposed to be a common transparency report. It's called the BTR, yeah? The Biennial Transparency Report that will come into effect in 2020. By 2024, we have to submit that. The big discussion now is how do you make sure that although there is a common transparency framework, how do you make sure that there is flexibility for developing countries? Yeah, that is something that's very, very key, because for developing countries, they said that we cannot be on this. So this is the first paragraph is important. An enhanced transparency framework for action and support with built-in flexibility, which takes into account parties' different capacities and builds upon the collective experience is established. So this is what is important. How do you have the flexibility? Because the developed world wants more and more reporting and more. So it's a huge obligation, actually. It's a lot of work, but then it can be done, but it also requires financial support. And so that's key. So right now there's a big discussion about what the flexibility is and how much we should be reporting. Next, please. Global stocktake, very important, because you have an NDC for, NDCs every 5 years. So there is also this architecture of the Paris Agreement, which is about a stocktake every 5 years. And it's supposed to take stock of the implementation of the Paris Agreement to assess the collective progress. That means the progress of all. It's not about naming and shaming. They wanted to avoid that. But you can bet that the developed country think tanks will always shine their light on developing countries to say where they have not done it. But they don't do the same for the developed, not enough, actually. So this is for collective progress towards achieving the purpose and its long-term goals. Very, very key. So it is to be done in a comprehensive and facilitative manner, considering mitigation, adaptation, and the means of implementation and support, and in the light of equity and best available science. So the best available science is the IPCC usually that they reference to, but equity is very key. How do you ensure that the collective progress is assessed in a way that shows whether equity is achieved or not? And this is the most difficult part of the process, because developed countries want to shut down and dilute equity as much as possible, and developing countries were arguing very much, and they are doing this to show what are the steps you need to do, what are the inputs you need to look at whether equity is being achieved or not. So the first global stocktake is supposed to take place in 2023. So next year is only one more year to work through that, to ensure that the first stocktake is done in a way that is really equitable, looks at equity and also looks at the best available science, and it's comprehensive. And the outcome of that shall inform parties in updating and enhancing in a nationally determined manner their actions and support in enhancing international cooperation for climate action. So basically, it's supposed to inform the preparation of your next NDC. So why they stress the in a nationally determined manner is because they don't want a top-down push again for countries to ratchet up their ambition. So what they want is a national determination, while there is a stocktake, but the process itself is nationally determined. Next, please. Finally, you have the Article 15 on implementation and compliance. This is an article, actually, a mechanism to facilitate implementation and promote compliance of the Paris Agreement. There's a committee that reports to the Conference of Parties annually, and it consists of a committee that shall be expert-based. is facilitative in nature and function, is transparent, it's non-adversarial and non-punitive, and attention to respective national capabilities and circumstances of parties. Actually, some developing countries actually wanted it to be differentiated, to be strong compliance for developed countries and much more flexible compliance for developing countries, much more facilitative. But the developed countries said, no, you can't have that. It has to be everybody in this way. So that's where we have landed. Yeah. Next. Okay, before I go into this, we can open up for question and answer. So basically, the question about Kyoto, Paris Agreement is the glass half full or half empty? And I think the issue is that it's the only global agreement you have at the moment on climate change. It doesn't go far enough, and within the political geopolitics, and I showed you some of the fights and battles, very, very difficult. But it is there, and we have to fight to keep it. And even if the glass is half full, how do you get the glass to make it fuller? Yeah. So that's the task that we have as climate justice movements, because otherwise there's nothing to hold developing countries to provide the financial resources and so on. And so it's very key that this multilateral agreement is strengthened as we go by. There's another discussion that's happening with some civil society groups who are saying that because this is not enough, that there's an idea and initiatives for actually looking at fossil fuel production and phase out within a just transition and so on. And so that's the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is being discussed. Some of you already know about it, but it may be useful to have a session on that with some members of the Fossil Fuel Treaty actually talking to you. But many of us are very careful with that as well, because the minute you talk about fossil fuel phase outs, how do you make sure that it's done in a just way, that the developed countries actually do first, and they are the ones who are phasing out first? Because what you see happening is that the developed world continues to rely on fossil fuels, and they talk about coal phase out because they don't have to rely so much, but they don't talk about oil and gas phase out. So that's a problem. I'll stop there for now, and let's entertain some questions.
Thank you, Meena.
My God, it's already 12:30.
Yes, I was going to point you to that. So there's an option to continue with your last section on COP26, and then we take the questions towards the end. For those who would like to stay behind, yeah, feel free to do so. What do you think about this arrangement, Meena?
No, I'm fine. What about this? The others?
So if you're fine, then we can proceed with COP26, and then we take all the questions at the end.
Okay.
All right, great, thank you.
Okay. Sorry, I took so long. Okay, COP26. Skip. Next slide. Okay, I want to very quickly go through the finance side of things, because for me, COP26 must be about an ambition on finance. And just to show you that the UNCTAD recently, that's the UN Conference on Trade and Development, has already said because of the COVID pandemic that the delivering on those ambitions is going to be difficult. And they say that you do need a North-South coordinated cooperation of an unprecedented scale across deeply interconnected economic, social, and environmental challenges. And they actually estimate that what would be required is an additional investment amounting to 2% of the global GDP annually, which is about $1.7 trillion per year in the next few decades. And this is to achieve the ambitions of Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement. Agenda 2030 is the SDGs, yeah? Okay, next. Evelyn, next. I won't go into this very much, only to show you that the 100 billion goal has not been per year, has not been achieved. Next slide. The OECD claims that they have reached 78.9 billion in 2018 or 80 billion in 2019. But if you look at how much it is, but largely it's loans, and they count adaptation is very little. And so, mainly climate mitigation. Next. Oxfam actually did a shadow report on climate finance, and what they show, and including taking into account the OECD report, they have shown that if you look at climate specific net assistance, it's only $19 to $22.5 billion. And again, mitigation is dominant, adaptation is little, and loans and other non-grant instruments are 80%. And so this is actually quite problematic. Next, please. So the MDB finance also the same thing. It's also 66 billion by that they claim that they have got, out of which 40% went to the Europe and the European Union. So you have to always examine what's behind the numbers. Next, please. One of the most important aspects that the LMDC and also the Arab group and the African group has been calling for is a definition on climate finance. Because if you don't have an operational definition for what is climate finance, as I said earlier, everything can be counted, mother, father, grandfather, granddaughter, everything is put in there. And so this is the problem. And how can you even call loans as climate finance? Long-term concessional loans, yes, the convention recognizes that, concessional loans and grants. But when you have loans which are quite commercial and not concessional enough, when you are going to pay back the loans, how can you even call it climate finance? And that's really a big issue. Next, please. So developing country needs, and this is just very important to show the needs. In the NDCs alone, developing countries have indicated $5.7 to $5.8 trillion by 2030, which is needed. If you look at adaptation needs, 140 to 300 billion by 2030, and 280 to 500 billion by 2050. And if you look at the adaptation funding channel through the UNFCCC multilateral funds, you only find the 1.25 billion per year between 2017 and 2018 was delivered. And the Global Commission on Adaptation talks about the need of $1.8 trillion US dollars from 2020 to 2030. Next, please. So where are we in the GEF replenishment? 40% less money has become available than before. This is ridiculous. In the Green Climate Fund, 10.3 billion was pledged initially in the initial resource mobilization. The US, Trump refused to put in 2 billion, which was supposed to do from the 10.3. So we are waiting for the US to commit to its 2 billion. That has not come in yet. But in the replenishment of the first GCF, it was 9.66 billion. We understand now it is 10 billion. And I'll show you a little bit more details a little bit later. So the 100 billion per year is far, far, far from where we need to be. Next. So I think we just to very quickly say that for those of you who are interested in finance and you want to look at what kinds of proposals are coming through, it's important to engage with the Green Climate Fund. It's based in Songdo. It was actually set up by the developing countries after a huge push, as you saw in Cancun. Reason is because the World Bank is very undemocratic. So they wanted a much more democratic fund. And this is actually, the GCF is supposed to have equal board of developing country and developed country members. Big fights happen. And they also talk about balanced treatment for mitigation and adaptation, a very important fund, and which will become more and more important as the climate crisis becomes worse. Next. The GCF resources, most recently, we found out, just 2 days ago, total committed 10 billion, number of projects approved 190, mitigation projects 68%, adaptation projects 32%. And the GCF's executive director actually said that by the time they go to COP, there will not be much money left because they've just committed $1.2 billion for 13 new climate projects. Because the way the commitment, although they say 10 billion, the disbursements are much less. Yeah. Next. Money is available. What is lacking is political will, and I'll show you why. The US, I like this quote by President Hugo Chavez in 2009 in Copenhagen. If the climate was a bank, they would have already been saved, yeah, because we know of the bank bailouts. And if you look at McKinsey in a recent study, it said that actually developed countries were able to deploy 10 trillion in just the first 2 months in response to the COVID. And this is 3 times more than the response to the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Next. And the EU alone, the Western European countries alone, they allocated close to 4 trillion, an amount 30 times larger than the Global Marshall Plan. And so you can see that at today's value. So this is not about no money. And the G7 governments provide at least 87.7 billion a year in support for fossil fuels. Yeah. And they have said that they will phase out fossil fuel subsidies. So this is something that they can make money available. Next. Special drawing rights very quickly has become more and more important now. The IMF has just issued 650 billion of special drawing rights to boost global liquidity. This is not for climate, but it's for global liquidity in response to the economic situation today. And what is SDR is actually created by the IMF in 1969 to support member countries' foreign exchange reserves. And it's based on a basket of currencies. And it's what's good about it is that it's non-conditional and it's non-debt creating. It's very important, yeah. But it's pointed out by the UN Secretary General, because the allocation is according to IMF quotas, because it depends on how much finance the countries put into the IMF, and it's not based on the actual fiscal need. 60% of the SDRs actually go to the wealthy countries. And so those who need it the most don't get it. So Antonio Guterres actually has called for a substantial reallocation of unused SDRs, not on a symbolic gesture, but much more of a substantial reallocation, including to middle income countries. I understand that there's a big discussion now in the IMF of how they're going to do it. So we have to watch this. Next. So it's about real finance for COP26. It won't happen without a big fight. And we need to have that big fight had. Next. Finally, I'll just very quickly, net zero I've talked about, and I've said that it's really a huge fraud actually to think that developed countries net zero is going to save the world. It's not. If you look at all the corporations and if you add up all their pledges for net zero, a lot of it is offsets and offsets in nature-based solutions in developing countries. So we won't have enough planets left. We'll have to have another few more planets. And maybe that's what Jeff Bezos and others are doing, another planet for discovery. Yeah, so they can plunder, not Jeff Bezos plundering, but I mean the developed world to plunder more. So the problem really is one of carbon colonialism, as we said. So offsets is a problem. There's no time for offsetting. What you do need to have is decarbonization, which means all sectors of the economy taking out more carbon from there. How do you do it in a way that's not geoengineering? And and that's something else for conversation. But if you look at, and also increasing sinks. So it's not about offsetting, because then what you have is it's already a license to continue to pollute while you offset and pretend that the fossil carbon can be sequestered by the trees, which is scientifically also not possible. So there are not enough nature to accommodate all offsets, and this is a big false solution, and it's a dangerous distraction from real decarbonization and reforestation that have to happen. The other is the NDCs. There's a big discussion about whether it should be a 5-year time frame, a 10-year time frame. I think some developing countries are saying let's have 5 years and 10 years, because what's more important is the content of your ambition and not so much about the time frame. So anyway, we'll see. So I've not talked about adaptation and loss and damage. There are lots of issues on the table as well, but the net zero and the carbon bucket and natural solutions and finance is where I think many of us will have to focus on. Net zero officially is not on the agenda, but it is the behind the scenes, and this is what the UK presidency wants to forge as the race to net zero, and they're all going to claim that, oh, we have saved the world, 100 countries and thousands of corporations have pledged net zero, we're going to save the world. And now don't believe that, because you really have to look at the details. Thank you. I think I've exhausted my time.
Thank you, Meena, for the very comprehensive 1.5 hour run through Paris Agreement and COP. So basically, I think everyone is full of information overload, but there are some questions that we can address on the chat box. So firstly, I would like to take Natalie's question from Kami. She's curious about the intellectual property rights gap between the developing and developed countries. Is this problem still very prominent, and how is it being addressed in the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, well, it's not being addressed sufficiently. I think some of the problems also is that if you have, like, say, the Technology Executive Committee, which is supposed to discuss these things, right? In the committee, you have developing country negotiators and developed country negotiators. Usually, our negotiators are not up to speed. They, like someone from an environment ministry or from another ministry put there, or some academic and whatever. So they need a lot of capacity actually in order to do the negotiations. So whether IPRs is sufficiently been addressed, there's these discussions around barriers and so on, but I think we actually need to do much more work on this in terms of where the actual IPRs are and are they really a barrier? Because the technology mechanism always looks at technology needs assessment. They say, oh, when many countries have done the needs assessment, what they don't have is actually the implementation of that need. And I think more work needs to be done. So I think we are still far away. I think we do need to tackle it. Yeah.
Thank you, Meena. The second question comes from Kavindran. So he has two parts of his question. The first is that he's asking if you can tell us more about the role of Dr. Gurdeep Singh Nijjar in biodiversity and biosafety and biodiversity discussion. And the second question is, what differs in terms of negotiation in between successes, such as the Montreal Protocol and this long line of complex failures of immediate inactions?
Wow, that's a huge question. Firstly, on Dr. Gurdeep, yeah, he also did represent the country in the biosafety and biodiversity conventions, and very, very key on the biosafety protocol, access and benefit sharing, and so on. So very key negotiator internationally, very, very articulate, very, very proud. I mean, we work with him, fantastic negotiator. That's why we got what we got in Paris. If not for him, it would have been very difficult. Good, we have good people and good negotiators, but when push comes to the shove, I call it like the final goalkeeper, like the Lionel Messi of your football game. You know, you pass, but you need somebody to strike the goal. And that you really need top class negotiators who understand the law, I mean, who see the nuances. And a lot of our negotiators do not understand. Language is a problem. They are non-lawyers. And the US actually comes with 20, 30 lawyers, you know. You won't believe it. And we have one or two, or maybe one from the AG's chambers who has to catch up, who doesn't even know. But thank God, in the run-up to Paris, we had very good negotiators. So the negotiating capacity is that's why we don't put enough weight in it. We really do need to. Otherwise, you keep losing. So yes, Gurdeep is a very key player, but he's no longer involved in the climate negotiations. I'm not sure to what extent he's involved in the CBD right now. The other thing about Montreal, yes, Montreal is important, but I don't know all the details. They also have the multilateral fund and the Montreal Protocol. That was very key. That was how the GCF was modeled, and for helping developing countries phase out of what did they phase out in the Montreal Protocol? The ozone depleting substances, yeah, ODS. So CFC. CFCs, yes. I'm not sure how well that has gone, but there's a big discussion now about phasing out methane and so on. Yes, methane is important, but I don't have time to go into all the details. So what's the next question?
The next question, actually there are two parts raised by two different people, but I'll read them in succession. So by Dura and Nicole both from Kami. The question is, how do you assess one country's NDC set to be fair or reasonable? And how is it when it is not too minimal as well? So how to assess the NDC set is not too minimal, and how to ensure that these NDC in sum promise the overall reduction in global emission and avoid 1.5 warming. And Nicole's question was building on Dura's question, which is with Malaysia announcing that it's going from 35% unconditional and 10% conditional in the past to 45% totally unconditional. What does it exactly mean for Malaysia? Is this an indication that the financing from developed countries to developing countries to help with the conditional NDCs has failed or ineffective? But I can repeat the second part of the question.
Yeah, that's quite a lot. The first question was in relation to what again? I forget.
Fair share.
Fair shares, yes. Okay. Very, very good question. Because we lost the fight over the equitable sharing of atmospheric space, which would have allowed to look at the budget and the historical emissions, cumulative emissions, present emissions, per capita emissions, who is doing what, who is a climate debtor, who is a climate creditor. So that's not there. So in Katowice, in Poland, there was this thing about countries have to say how their NDC is fair. That's all. So countries judge themselves. I am fair or not. What criteria? No criteria. So they can say whatever they want, right? So this is flawed. I mean, this is a flawed process. So many civil society groups have looked at this issue, and there's a lot of writing. And one of them is actually the CSO Equity Review, civil society. Evelyn can actually later give you a link that you can do. They've been looking at this, and they take a FASHAS approach. All of us in the demand climate justice, there's a global campaign to demand climate justice. We are all part of it. You can also Google that. And we are for FASHAS. And what we do is we also do the own judging ourselves. We take our FASHAS approach and we say, this country is not doing enough, that country is not doing enough. And we also look at, now we're looking at loss and damage, we're looking at, so there are a lot of assessments coming from the CSOs themselves. Of course, how they go forward, because they don't have any authority in the convention, because we can't speak about it inside, but it's useful for the media. And that's where the messaging, the narrative outside, calling the fraud of the net zero by looking at what they are doing and not doing. So that's how we would do. So it's really about making sure that we hold the governments to account in the public space. And that's the way we will go forward. What's the other question, Evelyn? Malaysia.
I'm just looking at the following question from Beijing, which is quite related to what Dura said. So she asked, if a country's NDC is 50% reduction by 2030, how do they count that 50% reduction? Is it like if 2030, the whole country's emission is less than the baseline year, then that means 50 reduction goal is achieved?
Wow, that's a very technical question. I'm not really a technical expert, but one of the issues is precisely that, is it where do you look at? Is it at the end, or is it year by year? All these are issues that are being discussed under the transparency framework as well, on what are you reporting and how do you look at it. But actually, internally for Malaysia, I think we need to find out what is that roadmap. How does it look like? What is the content? And I understand that even that carbon neutrality by 2050 is not something that was really, I won't say not thought through, but I think there was a bit of a surprise. Let me say. So how exactly this 45% emissions intensity target is going to reach that? It's something that I think we need to really look at and ask for and demand that more information is forthcoming and that we all are part of it. Because NDC is actually, if you look at the Paris Agreement, supposed to have a national process, which is far more consultative and participatory, not just with us, but even the private sector. So on this 10% on the conditional and unconditional, now we have been puzzled by that removal of the 10%. Actually, to be honest with you, Third World Network wrote a letter to CASA and also to KETSA. And our view was that instead of removing the 10% removing the 10% conditional, we actually suggested raising it to 55% so that you have 45% domestic and 10% conditional. And our reason for that is that you need to show more ambition, and you can show that with more money from abroad that you can do it. Now, whether it's because, and it is very, very confusing for us because there is money that we are also receiving, we say in the next few years for the Malaysia Forest Fund, which includes REDD Plus money or other money from other sources. So how can you say that there is all domestic? How can that be all domestic money? So a lot of questions have also arisen, but answers have not been forthcoming. We've had no responses to our letters, either to KETSA, except for one letter from KETSA reply. Further follow-up, no response. CASA doesn't reply, so we'd have no, I can go public on that CASA has not replied. So I think we need to demand for more, and we need to engage more. And one of our concerns is that because your NDC has to be is progression, that what we need to actually understand and show is that the link with the finance is so key. We can do what we can do nationally and domestically, but we can do more if there is more finance, and we need to show that. And so for that, we need to understand what our needs are. Have we done a needs assessment of what we need? And in terms of finance and technology, have we quantified it? Have we said that this is how we're going to go? So these are all the things that we need to actually get ready for before the next NDC is submitted, which would be 2031 onwards.
Thank you, Mina. So just to sum that up, so when Malaysia ratcheted up its commitment from unconditional, from conditional 10% to totally unconditional, that does not imply that financing from developed countries are failed or ineffective, right?
No.
Yes, thank you. So the following question is from Adrian Yo. He asked, does all the commitments within Kyoto expire with Paris?
That's a very good question. It's really on the big debate right now. The issue really now is that in the second commitment period phase, because the targets were supposed to come into effect earlier, but they didn't. So now everybody is in the NDC world from 2021 onwards. What happens to the pre-Kyoto and what happens to the post-Kyoto? I mean, not post-Kyoto, post-second commitment period. So the Africa group has actually put a agenda on the table about extending the Kyoto Protocol, not extending the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol is not dead, but the third commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, they're saying we should be looking at the third commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. But you can expect developed countries to say, forget it. I mean, we are already in the Paris NDCs. It's overlapping. Our targets are already subsumed. But what the like-minded developing countries have said very clearly is that whatever gap in the pre-2020 timeframe, whether under the Kyoto Protocol or not under the convention, those emissions gap must be met and cannot be shifted to the developing countries. So that they have made very clear.
Thanks, Mina. Another question from Shamila. So she asked, the negotiations complex is contextualized within the dynamics of developed versus developing countries, as we know from throughout your presentation. So does it really make a difference if the government is communist, socialist, the various labor types?
Good question, Shamila. The dynamics, I mean, at the end of the day, it's not just the governments, but there's a huge effort also by the Demand Climate Justice Coalition to also expose the fact that many countries have on their delegations, particularly from the developed world, corporations who are sitting there and who are negotiating. For instance, like in the carbon trading, the international IETA, International Emissions Trading Association, some of them are very involved in the negotiations. Fossil fuel corporations are also involved behind the scenes, sometimes in front of the scenes. So a lot of lobbies go. So whether you are a socialist or whether you are the social democratic, whether you are capitalist, it is power play. That's where it all happens. So the North-South dynamics, of course, within the developing world, as I said, there's also sometimes weaker negotiating capacities for some countries. If you're a country who is dependent on foreign loans, it's going to be very hard for you to have a strong negotiating capacity, asking the United States to do more, or the UK to do more, or Japan to do more, because you're depending on loans. And we know for a fact that even in the last final hours of the Paris negotiations, President Obama was calling presidents around the world and so on. So it's not your negotiators there. Politicians get involved. I showed you how Copenhagen Accord was negotiated, 30 in the room and non-transparent and so on. So it's really high stakes. And the other thing that I'd like to mention is that in the final hours of the negotiations, they begin to involve ministers. Before that, they always involve negotiators. Negotiators means your person from your CASA or WISMA or whoever who are sitting there who are negotiating. The technical people and with some mandates, yeah. But when it comes to the final hours where you need a political decision, this is where they bring them into small rooms and they usually facilitate it with a developed country minister and a developing country minister. And usually the developed country minister is far more, I mean, their language is not really an issue for most of them. They know what their agenda is. And the developing country ministers may not even know what is going on. So we've seen this time and time and again. It's always unequal bargaining and unequal, negotiating. So this is why you have to negotiate from a strength of knowing what the agenda is. What are you up against? And some countries, oh, we must look good. We must look progressive. We cannot afford to look like the bad guys. And there is a narrative that comes with that. And you can see that we saw that in Paris. They created what was called the coalition of ambition. So they brought in the US, they brought in Brazil, they brought in everybody, and they targeted the like-minded. And they said, oh, and then somebody asked me on TV, and there's a recording there in French television. Oh, why do you think that, don't you think that the like-minded developing countries should also be in the coalition of ambition? See, like the United States and all that. So I said, what coalition of ambition are you talking about? Because the coalition of ambition was against intellectual property rights, was against targets for finance, was against fair shares, equitable sharing of atmospheric space. So how can you call that ambitious? So the narrative, everybody who doesn't understand falls into this false narrative of blaming somebody else. And the blame is usually on the developing countries who stand for equity and who stand for the convention and who stand for common and differentiated responsibility, who stand for historical responsibility, and who stand for what we need to do in terms of fairness in the world, of a real just kind. So this is what it is. I mean, I'm sorry I'm giving you a long answer to a question, but I think the dynamic, and we have to go prepared. If you have 20, 30 negotiators who are from the what do you call it, of the US, with top-notch lawyers, knowing every full stop and comma. And what do? We've got 5, 6 negotiators who don't even know how the Paris Agreement came to be.
Thanks, Meena. And I think every one of us appreciate your insight for being in all these COPs meeting over the years. And really, a lot of people are just consuming news based on the major headlines and not really getting a peek of what is the nitty-gritty geopolitical issues. So speaking of agenda, as you mentioned just now, Nico, I have a question on that. Is there any insights that you have on Malaysia's agenda for COP26? Are our representatives going to be advocating for fair shares, or are we going to be more aligned to the net zero hype and using that to show that we have made progress?
Very good question. I'm the wrong person to answer. I think you should post this question to Zaini Ujang whenever you can, or even write a letter to him. The last consultation we had, the position wasn't clear to us, because all we were told was that, these are the issues. And when we asked what the positions are, we were told that give your input so that we can formulate the positions. So the answer, long and short of it all, is I don't know what Malaysia's positions are. But on the finance issue, we did push, and we said that we need to make sure that we have very good outcomes on the finance. And we had the commitment given to us that, yes, we will be part of the G77 and we will be part of ASEAN, and we will be negotiating and making sure that our interests are protected.
And one last question from Claire, something to do with RED+. Perhaps you can comment on how successful or unsuccessful it has been globally as a learning point for Malaysia.
We in Third World Network are drawing up a briefing paper on this. It's not easy to understand, and we are just in the beginning stages of implementation. There has been some capacity building done before by KETSA, but we are very uncertain as to how exactly the safeguards are going to be respected, because in Cancun it was negotiated that there should be safeguards negotiated, like the UN DRIP, pre-prior informed consent, indigenous people's rights, all that will be safeguarded. So we really do need to follow that. And how successful, there have been cases of problems. I'm not sure about how much success there is because we don't have information, but there has been information about some problems. Yeah, I think we need to keep monitoring. We have groups like Monga Bay and Carbon Watch and others who are actually monitoring some of these things. I think we are only scratching the surface, and this is why I agreed with Evelyn that we should have this, because I do think that we need to understand the difficulties of international negotiations. At the same time, I think we do need to push our government a lot more to being more transparent with us as civil society, because we have not seen that come forward so much.
Thank you, Meena. Perhaps as a closing remark, one final question from me is that we are expecting major news outlets to push out headlines like the COP has failed or the COP has been successful. So how do we sieve through all these issues that we are seeing and be critical about what we are looking at? What do you suggest that we Malaysian NGOs or individuals discern all these headlines?
Yeah, for those of you who are very interested, please read the Third World Network update. We report on the climate negotiations. Sometimes we stay up all night writing them. But because the team is not going to, Evelyn and I are not going to Glasgow, mainly because of the risks, because already health risks, because already you will have, very difficult access into the negotiating rooms for civil society. We are usually allowed to follow the first part of the negotiation and the last part. Usually we are out. And so now with COVID and restrictions, we probably will not get access to many of the negotiations. So we learn really from following some of our negotiators who are friends. And so we will try as much as possible to follow what is available on the webcast, and we'll try and report them. So do read the Third World Network updates. Sometimes they're very technical, but they're meant to actually say what the voices of developing countries are. Because what we also show is that before we came on the scene as Third World Network, you will notice that you have the Earth Negotiations Bulletin reporting with 1 line and 2 lines, and you don't know who said what and what the fight was. But Third World Network, we give you the details of the fights. And so we will do that. And also there will be press conferences held by the DCJ, what's called the Climate Justice Now constituency. And those press conferences are open. You can also watch it, not live, but later. And you will hear some of there are a lot of voices coming from, I think they also might be virtual, including roping us in to speak. So many of us will give our views. So we will have to pay attention to. So if you follow Evelyn and Third World Network, I think you will get the sense of it, because she'll be tweeting and she'll be writing.
Thank you, Meena. And finally, thank you everyone for joining us this morning towards the afternoon and for staying until the very end. And if you have more questions, feel free to send us an email. Meena is at meena@twnetwork.org, and I'm Evelyn at twnetwork.org. And I just put it on the screen today for you all to see that this is the book that Meena has put together with Martin Kaur, The Clash of Climate Paradigms. So all the negotiations, outcomes, and issues basically are here. So if you're interested to get the book, you can scan the QR code on the screen, or you can just speak to us and we'll be happy to assist. So if there's nothing else, Well, we'll end this session here today. And again, thank you so much.
Thanks, Meena. Thanks, Evelyn. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks to you all for staying on. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much.
Meena, would you make your slides available to everyone?
Yeah, there's nothing controversial there. It's just public. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so we'll put it up on our GDI website. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a nice weekend.
Okay, so end the meeting now.
Yes, please.